Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Cambridge Conversations event. My name is David Runciman. I'm Professor of Politics here in Cambridge at the Department of Politics and International Studies. This is the 11th in this very popular series of Cambridge Conversations. And we're going to be talking over the next 50 minutes about democracy, about confidence in democracy and how the future of democracy looks in the light of our global experience of the pandemic. I'm going to be talking to Lucia Rubinelli and Roberto, and I'll be introducing them to you in a second, just to remind you that we'll be speaking for about half an hour, and then we want to have 20 minutes of your questions. And you can send us your questions by using the Q&A function on your screens. If you type in your questions there, they will, by the miracle of modern technology, reach us, and we won't be able to get to all of them, I'm afraid, probably, but we will try and answer as many as we can. I think we're all aware that the last few years have been challenging for democratic politics around the world. Here in Cambridge, we have a Centre for the Future of Democracy, thinking about future prospects for democratic politics. We think about democracy globally in different international settings, but also in broad historical perspective. And there are a range of different ways of thinking about the history of democracy. There's a long history of modern democracy going back to the 19th and 20th centuries, which is broadly speaking a success story. There is the more recent history that I alluded to there. The last few years, the last decade really, has been challenging. The challenges coming out of the financial crisis, challenges of information technology and the digital revolution, which has in many ways upended many of our expectations about how democracy should work, ongoing future challenges, including climate change, and our increasing awareness in many democracies of rising partisanship, polarization, and what is often called populism. And now there is the short-term history, the recent history that we've all experienced over the last year of the pandemic. So I had to think about how these different things relate to each other. I'm joined by Roberto, who is lecturer in public policy here in Cambridge at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. He is co-director of the Centre for the Future of Democracy. He's also director of the Cambridge YouGov Partnership, which does polling research. And Roberto has published a very influential, widely read series of reports and articles looking at global satisfaction with democracy over the medium term, but also in lots of different settings. I'm also joined by Lucia Rubinelli, who is a junior research fellow in the history of political thought at the Department of Politics and International Studies, also at Robinson College. Lucia has written widely about the history of democracy and about ideas of popular power and the different ways in which we might think about, and we will discuss this, the challenge of populism for democratic politics. Lucia has also, over the past year, been in Italy, and we might talk about the Italian experience too. So Roberto, if I could start with you. So you published work in the lead up to the pandemic using the data set that you have access to, a unique global data set, looking at opinion surveys, asking people whether they are satisfied with democracy. And you told a story before the pandemic, and I'll summarize it very briefly here, but it was a story. There's not a single story because different things have been experienced in different parts of the world, but the global picture was of increasing dissatisfaction with democracy. And you also published a report highlighting dissatisfaction among younger citizens and voters in particular. Then the pandemic hit. So what have you seen since? How has that story continued? Has it been upended, or has that trend broadly held?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no, David. So, it's incredible that just after we published that first report, the pandemic hit. And actually, one of the real surprises for 2020 was that during the first months of the pandemic, satisfaction with democracy, in fact, shot up in almost every country, including countries like Italy or Greece, where it had been quite low up until that point. But looking into that a little bit further, we have a student with the center, Thomas Freitag, who's been investigating this. And what he's found is that this is actually a very generalized phenomenon, that whenever you have a natural disaster that hits, whether it's an epidemic, whether it's an earthquake, a landslide, a wildfire, people's satisfaction and trust in government tends to increase, but it doesn't increase for very long. It only tends to increase on average for about 4 to 6 months, a sort of rally around the flag effect, if you will. And that's pretty consistent with what we've seen as we get to the tail end of 2020 and the data, so at the end of last year. By the end of last year, most countries had started or fully returned back to their baseline where they started. But at the same time, I think one of the really interesting things that we'll be teasing out a bit more in our next report is how there has been some divergence, and that divergence does seem to track how well countries have responded, both to the pandemic and then in the data from this year, success or failure during the vaccine rollout.
So that divergence, is it surprising to you? Have you seen things, or has stuff emerged from the data that goes against your expectations? I think we're all aware there are success stories. New Zealand is often held up as a success stories. Within different countries like the United Kingdom, the UK was held up for a long time as one of the failures of pandemic governance, but the vaccination rollout has changed that narrative. When you look at it, what surprised you over the past year about how people have responded to this question of satisfaction in their democracies?
I think one of the surprise observations has been in Southern Europe. So Italy, for example, is a good case where we saw this increase in satisfaction at the very initial months of the pandemic, but that actually seems to have sustained until the end of last year, whereas that wasn't the case in other countries. France, for example, had gone all the way back to its historic lows by the end of last year. I think the UK has also been a surprise in some ways. There's been huge shifts. I mean, we have, thanks to YouGov, almost daily data from the UK for the last 2 years. And so during the first lockdown, satisfaction with democracy in the UK was actually at one of its highest levels in about 10 years. By October, it had gone back to its historic low. And now it's actually gone about to the historic norm, so just above half of UK citizens who say that they're satisfied with how British democracy is working.
Lucia, that seems like a good point to bring you in, because you can talk a little bit, we'll get onto the history and the broader picture in a moment, but you can talk a bit about the Italian experience. Italian democracy is often held up as a kind of model for the dissatisfactions and some of the challenges, and those things that I mentioned before, including the challenge of populism has been very acute in Italy. Italy was also at the front line of the pandemic. What have you seen over the past year? How would you characterize the responses of the Italian public to the performance of their democracy over the past year?
Well, I think I would characterize them as both surprising and unsurprising at the same time. And I think that what happened in Italy, I mean, as Roberto mentioned, right, so Italy followed a trend in the sense that immediately after the start of the pandemic, there was a general sense of satisfaction with Italian politics, the rally around the flag effect. But that, I think, played out in Italian politics in a very peculiar way, in the sense that, again, immediately after the pandemic started, also because Italy was the first European country to face it, there was a sense in which there was a lot of faith in the government. Conte enjoyed more than 60% of approval rating, which is unseen of in Italian politics. And I think more generally, it's not just satisfaction with the government, but a general sense of, trust in politics. It became evident that politics could do a lot of things that before were thought of impossible. Politics could lock you in. I mean, Italians couldn't leave their house for 2 months. Politics could impose a fire ban on employers, totally unheard of in the years of austerity that preceded the pandemic. At the same time, politics became much more necessary as well, because it was evident that the science could not give an answer, and that the only answers or the only directions could be given by politics. And politics became also more visible because, again, Conte, the prime minister at the time, was always on the television, was always giving speeches. But then, so there was this time of sort of honeymoon with the possibilities of politics that then abruptly ended before Christmas. And I think this is maybe a difference between Italy and some of the other countries that Roberto has looked at, which is that this honeymoon ended quite abruptly. And what we got instead is technocracy again. So there is so in a way, it's nothing new, because Italy is quite used to having moments in which it falls in love with leaders and then technocracy kicks in. But I think this year was particularly surprising because of just how quickly everything happened and how extremely it happened. So you passed from having a prime minister that enjoyed approval ratings that were very uncommon for Italian politicians to having a level of distrust in politics so high as to demand the European central banker to become an unelected prime minister. So I think, again, similar usual patterns playing out, but in a very concentrated time frame and playing out in very acute forms.
Because as you mentioned it there, so you use the phrase satisfaction with politics, but of course we're talking particularly here about democracy. And I think for most people, the idea of a technocratic government, it's still politics in a sense. I mean, we could argue about that, but it seems like a challenge to our understanding of democratic politics. And there's the technocratic challenge on one side, and then conventionally it's understood there's a populist challenge on the other. There was our colleague here in Cambridge, Chris Bickerton, has written in his recent book called Techno-Populism. These two things don't necessarily always pull in different directions. How do you see, Lucia first and then Roberto, how do you currently see populism in relation to democratic politics? Has the pandemic, as some people thought, because it put such a premium on what is sometimes called competence, has the pandemic damaged the populist bandwagon, or do you still see it as something that's coming for democratic politics?
So I think that in a way it did damage populist politics. So for example, if I think about Italy, Salvini certainly was damaged by the pandemic, and some of his, the usual lines he would run to rally his base just wouldn't fly anymore, because it became evident that some sort of technical expertise was needed, that the lockdown was needed, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. But then at the same time, I also think, I might be wrong, but my impression is that looking to the future, what the pandemic has revealed is that politics can have a scope that is larger than what we normally assume it to be. And that in a sense, if populism can be seen as a way of expressing dissatisfaction to the limits of representative politics as it has been done in the past 10, 15, 20 years, then maybe the pandemic has gone a bit in that direction, in opening up space for more political choices to be available, and for things that were before thought of, again, impossible, becoming possible. Think about just what the Biden presidency is doing in the US. So I think it cuts both ways.
And Roberto, because in the reports that you were writing before the pandemic hit, you did trace a relationship between dissatisfaction with democracy and what is conventionally called populist challenges to established or conventional political parties. How have you seen that relationship develop over the past year?
Well, I'm not sure. It's too soon to tell whether the pandemic has damaged populism. I think the only thing I could say for now, based on the survey and the polling data, is that there's been a very inconsistent effect on populists. And really the key difference there is just how leaders responded to the pandemic. So, Bolsonaro or Trump, because they took minimal action in response to the pandemic, and that ultimately damaged their credibility with their respective publics. But of course, there are plenty of other countries where you've had populist leaders in power who took quite drastic initial actions, India or Hungary or other places. And were able to sort of garner some legitimacy personally from that. So I think the effect on populists is still quite unclear.
And of course, as we now know, there isn't a single story here, because Hungary and Italy are now at the forefront of the worst effects of the pandemic. A year is a long time in pandemic politics, and politicians who were doing badly are now doing well, and politicians who are doing well are now doing badly. And here in the UK, we've got good old-fashioned elections. I'd just been to vote, and I did what I was told, which was I brought my own pencil to the polling station so that I didn't have to share my pencil with anyone else. But in these elections, it looks like the incumbent government is going to buck historic trends and do much, much better than incumbent governments normally do under normal conditions. So it's very hard to establish a pattern here. I want to just broaden this out a little before we bring in questions from our audience. And Lucia, I want to ask you a sort of historical question, and then Roberto, you a question about how to think about the present. But we've been talking, and I try to avoid this. I mean, it's hard to find the language when discussing what's called populism, because it's a very negative connotation. On the whole, when people talk about populists, they tend to be speaking critically. Lucia, you've written about the history of, let's broadly call it, popular politics in democracies, and representation, which is one of the things we've come to associate with democratic politics, is only one way of doing democracy. And of course, it is designed in many ways to stifle the direct impact of the people on political choices. Do you think that we have too narrow a conception of what populism is? Do you think we've spent too much time caricaturing it as a threat to democracy and missed the ways in which historically populism has been occasionally the lifeblood of democracy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the case. And of course, discourse about populism in the recent years has tended to look back at, and had a tendency to make comparisons. So for example, you'd have the most recent one was between Macron and Napoleon, made just yesterday because of the 200th anniversary of Napoleon's death, or between Trump and Mussolini, right? So there is a lot of use of history to make this kind of comparison between current populism and what one could call Caesaristic or populist leaders in the past. But I think the history of democracy, especially the last 200 years, has much more to say about populism. And it becomes clear if you look at this history that, the history of democracy is a way of trying to make sense of who are the people, how is their power exercised, who can exercise power on their behalf. And in the past, again, 250 years, many ways of articulating this relationship between the people, their power, and the representatives have been experimented with. And there have been more. So, for example, take an example, the referendum, which we today tend to think about, especially after Brexit, we tend to think about as a eminently populist institution. But if you look at the history of the referendum, what you realize is that, yes, it was used to legitimize power of Caesaristic leaders such as Napoleon, but it was also used to advance progressive agendas. So, for example, the referendum was really championed by some social democrat thinkers and leaders in order to pass bills that would improve the condition of the workers or that would give the vote to women. Now, not all of these referendums took place, but the idea of using the referendum was also part of a type of popular politics that wasn't necessarily aimed at legitimizing one person rule or again a Caesaristic populist leader, but that was just meant at involving the people in a democratic fashion, sometimes even in a deliberative fashion, in taking fundamental decisions. So yes, again, I think that populism is not necessarily antagonistic to democracy, but it is rather part of a continuum of ways of thinking and doing and exercising popular power.
Because Roberto, when you look at your survey data and you think about this question of satisfaction with democracy, and we're already getting questions coming in about this, what exactly is it that's being measured, and are we really thinking about how people view democracy, or are we thinking about how they view the performances of their governments? Are they responding to sort of economic rather than political factors? But that there is a broader question, which is, how are people conceptualizing the alternative? When they think that I'm frustrated with democracy, are they thinking I'm frustrated with this way of doing democracy, but I want a different way of doing democracy? Or are they thinking I'm frustrated with democracy and I want a non-democratic way of doing politics? Is there a way of teasing that out from the data? Do you have a sense of that, whether really this is frustration with one version of democracy among many, or with democracy itself?
Yeah, there is some survey data that can help tease that out. So there are a number of different question batteries out there. One of the ones I really like is one that has been fielded for several years now by YouGov in a youth survey, where when people responded that there are other systems of government better than democracy, there was a follow-up question, which was like, well, what is it? Like, what is the system of government that's better than democracy? And people had a choice from a wide range of options. And the short answer is that there's no consistency there. So some people would indeed say technocratic government. We need civil servants and scientists and economists running the country. Some people would say, revolutionary communism or socialism. Some people would say, some form of military army rule or authoritarian government. I mean, you had a kind of wide range of things. And of course, there's also a large number of people who would say they wanted direct democracy as an alternative to representative democracy. So there's not really a single consistent sort of alternative waiting in the wings. But the way I read that is that really people have a much clearer idea of what they don't like, or what they don't see working, than a really well thought out conceptualization of what an alternative way of doing politics might look like.
And this is a question for both of you. Do you think that part of the frustration with democracy over recent years is a function of the fact that we are coming off this success story, this really great success story in the second half of the 20th century, The 1990s is a sort of golden period for many people, for thinking about democratic politics, that end of history era. A lot has changed since then. I mean, the world has radically changed, not just through the digital revolution, but in lots of other ways too. And yet politics still feels a little frozen from that period. If you think of how much has changed in all of our lives, we've lived through this period. And yet how little has changed institutionally with our democratic politics. It's such a familiar, there I am going along with my pencil today. It's such a familiar, but also in its way, slightly frozen form of politics. Do you think some of this dissatisfaction is simply because democratic politics hasn't really evolved over the last 30 years, while the world has been evolving at a breakneck speed? Do you think that's part of it? Either of you?
I think it is. I mean, one of the classic questions that's been asked for decades now is, people are asked to rate their trust in different institutions in society. How much do you trust civil society organizations? How much do you trust, the government, parliament, the media, business, civil service, judiciary, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that's really surprised me, actually, particularly in the last few years of data, is how even as trust in politicians and the government has declined in many places, trust in business is actually quite strong. And in an age of populism, that strikes me as particularly a weird observation. But maybe that does get a little bit to your point, David, about the ways that people interact with services and what is seen as being more cutting edge, more responsive, more effective than maybe government is behind in some of these respects.
Because, Lucia, to take the Italian example, I mean, Italy has seen a remarkable experiment with a new kind of politics. The five-star movement, in the space of a decade, more or less, has gone from nowhere, offering what looked like a radical alternative to conventional representative democracy, much more direct involvement of the people, much more a direct use of this technology to create policy options. From there into government, and already the arc seems to have, we've crested the hill, and five-star looks like it's in classic decline. It's sort of lived the life of a political party that normally takes 100 years in about 8. How do you look at the five-star experiment now? Does it look like another of those things that really establishes just how stale and fixed politics is, because this seemingly radical alternative got co-opted by the system so quickly?
Well, I think even if one looks at the history of democracy from a historical perspective, right, at times of big technological change or change in the labor market, etc., these times always come with some sort of turmoil, also the political level and also the level of political institutions. So there are always times of experimentation with politics. And I tend to see what happened to the five-star movement as exactly one such experiment. So it looks like it failed, in the sense that the mode of democratic politics that they wanted to bring to Rome just got co-opted, as you said, right? So they are still voting on their online platform, even though now they're going through a legal divorce with the private owner of that platform. So who knows what's going to come out of that? But so some of the formalities are still there, but certainly the people who entered parliament have become politicians. Which is exactly what Grillo, the founder, didn't want to happen. But I guess if one takes a bit of a longer term perspective, I think I would see the five-star movement as just one attempt at bringing the way in which we do democratic politics up to speed with what's going on, and especially with the technology. It's an attempt that's doomed to fail. It was doomed to fail from the start. But it's not, I suppose it's not the last one, and there will be more of those attempts. And anyhow, I think that they did something that, so it's not just that they used the technology, right, that was available. It's also that they brought people who were not politicians, were not professional politicians, into parliament. And then they became politicians while doing the work of politics. And I think that's also a very important novelty that they brought in. And again, who knows whether this will evolve or whether there will be new experiments in that direction.
So we're getting lots of fascinating questions coming in, and I want to start weaving those in to our conversation. And we've got a couple of questions which sort of touch on this in a way. And Roberto, it's partly a question for you about how you measure satisfaction with democracy. Is there a correlation between people's satisfaction with democracy and the voting system? Is there a, can you identify a voting system that's more likely to leave people feeling satisfied with their politics than the others? And this question says, if so, why?
Okay, an easy question and a more difficult one, follow-up. So the easy question or answer is yes. So at least as it is in the world now, we find that countries with proportional representation systems have higher satisfaction with democracy than countries with majoritarian plurality systems. So countries in Northern Europe, by and large, vis-a-vis Anglo-Saxon democracies, by and large, except for New Zealand. So that's the easy part of it. And then the difficult part is to explain why. And that's a tricky one, actually, because this is a new observation. This gap didn't really exist in the same way as it does today 30 or 40 years ago. So why has there been this divergence? And I think part of it is just the way that majoritarian systems, first past the post systems, leave a lot of people without effective political power, in the sense that, if you had been a voter, in the American Midwest or in the north of England, you were, up until recently, these were, so to speak, safe seats for dominant political parties, and they didn't really necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily as a voter in those places necessarily have a great deal of influence. Having said that, of course, if you're in the political minority in New York or California or Utah, then you probably also feel the same way, in the sense that your vote's not actually going to change the outcome. So I think with proportional representation systems, I mean, really, like, every vote counts, every vote is equal, regardless of where you are in that country. And so that leads to a couple of outcomes. I mean, the first is that you feel that you have more political agency, because in the sense that you do. And the second outcome, which is perhaps more subtle, is that it tends to produce coalitional politics. And so in an age, and I think this may explain why it's happened recently, that in an age of social media polarization and division and demonization, your system of politics inherently short circuits that to a degree, because political parties who don't agree with one another and maybe on different sides of the political divide have to find a way of working together, appearing together, being on the stage together. And I think that perhaps in some sense helps to reduce some of that polarization spiral.
And yet, isn't it also some of the dissatisfaction with democracy at the moment precisely with what looks like conventional coalition politics, a kind of what grand coalitions in Germany, or a sort of mushy centrism, the idea that you'll split the difference and the parties will negotiate it between themselves. We had a coalition government in the UK, and at the end of that, the junior coalition partner was destroyed. There is, I mean, under a first past the post system where you can destroy political parties, but it feels, at least anecdotally, like that also is one of the drivers of dissatisfaction, that sense that coalition politics is often a stitch-up.
I think that's true. That is true historically in countries where you've had, really highly fractionalized electorates with lots of divisions between people along different lines, and therefore, in the French Fourth Republic, right, or in Belgium, most of the time, you have this kind of constant coalitional politics going on, and people feel dissatisfied with that, especially when you have, relatively short-lived governments, you have periods of where there is no government in power, simply because of the difficulty of reaching a consensus between different political actors. So that particular scenario is not good for satisfaction of democracy, and it's always a danger of proportional representation. However, I think the one thing that proportional representation does, and Germany is actually a good case in this regard, is that when you have new political ideas and forces, it's possible to refresh the political system. In Germany, the Green Party could break through and actually be part of a coalition government. And so you have that a significant minority of society can feel represented, can have a change in the whole dynamic of politics. And the same is true with regards to populism as well, I would say. In countries in Southern Europe where populist parties have been brought in and formed coalitions with mainstream parties, in a way, that normalization process diffuses as well some of the disruptive energy of populism, but also some of the toxic energy that it brings as well.
So there's a broader question here which relates to that, and the question is simply, are we well served by our political parties? So not about the system itself, but parties. And of course, political parties are one of the institutions that sometimes feel a little frozen. that many of them have been around for a long time and they're quite hard to displace. But in recent years, over the past decade or more, there have been radical shifts. So in France, Macron created a party out of nothing, a movement which became a party. We've talked about Five Star here, that there's the rise of green politics in various parts of the world. There have been disruptions to the party system. Lucia, do you think that, and whether from an Italian or a broader perspective, do you think that the party system itself is increasingly looking vulnerable and under strain? Do you think actually, because it's one of the hardest things to imagine, representative democracy beyond political parties, but do you think we're starting to see a glimpse of that?
Well, certainly the party system is under strain. And again, I was going back to what Roberto was saying earlier about coalition governments, right? And I mean, I see all the arguments in favor of coalition governments as bringing in new energies. Then at the same time, and here I'm thinking mostly from an Italian perspective, coalition governments are also the governments in which parties are not responsible for whatever is decided. They can always shift the blame on the other coalition partners. So I think that, at least again, from an Italian perspective, part of the difficulty with the party system is just that parties can be very movable and can shift responsibility very, very easily. And hence people start losing faith and trust in parties because you are no longer able to trace what connects your vote with the decisions taken by the party in parliament. Having said that, I certainly think that there are new trends or new ways of thinking, alternatives to party systems. And again, they are discussed in the literature quite a lot. For example, the idea of using the lottery. So instead of having parties, you would randomly pick citizens and you would ask them to take decisions, or the idea of using citizens' assemblies in which citizens are asked to deliberate after extensive study of certain issues on what should be done. So certainly there are experiments being done with democratic politics to try and look beyond party politics. But again, I think this comes with the challenge of then being difficult to hold anybody accountable for the decisions that are taken. And of course, accountability is one of the key mechanisms of representative politics.
So we have a question here which touches on the central theme of our conversation and where we started, which is how we should think about the pandemic and its implications for democracy. And the question is faith in democracy not a different thing from the doubtless unrealistic hopes that people place in government when there is a disaster? And if I could broaden that out a bit, there is a real question here about how atypical the last year has been. And you both touched on this in different ways. There's a sense over the last year that something fundamental has been revealed about politics. And we've learned the extent to which we are very dependent on government to coordinate action under these kinds of conditions. And we've discovered, I think to our surprise, that most of us are willing to obey quite stringent, almost draconian restrictions on our personal liberty. There was a thought at the start of the pandemic that 2 weeks was about the limit that people would be willing to be put up with being told to stay in their homes. And dare I say it, even in Italy, people were willing to stay in their homes. And even now, actually, a year in, there's still a remarkable amount of obedience. And yet at the same time, I think we all have a sense that the hunger for something new, for at least thinking beyond this current politics, this almost ultra frozen moment where we were frozen in our homes and our governments were just doing whatever they could to get us through the disaster. Do you feel that? Do you feel that there's a kind of double movement at work here? On the one hand, we've been reminded almost of not timeless truths, but long-standing truths about politics. It is about life and death. It's about power. These people have real coercive authority over us. We vote them in democracies, but having voted them in, they can tell us what to do. And at the same time, there's a growing frustration with ordinary citizens not being able to make their own choices. Do you see those things sort of pulling against each other as we come out of the pandemic? Roberto, do you want to start with that? Sure.
I think that, in many ways, what the pandemic has done is it's merely suspended problems that were there, and we're going to have to deal with all of them, now, essentially. one of the reasons why I was so clear to say at the outset that, you know, there was this spike in satisfaction with democracy, but we shouldn't read too much in that, because this is a very general phenomenon, that you have this sort of rally around the flag effect whenever you have a natural disaster or an epidemic of any kind. We see that, but it doesn't last very long. And so it's not telling us that suddenly people have reflected and decided that, you know, democratic systems are functioning great. What it tells us
and they
is
like
that
being told what to do. They don't.
It's quite a short-term psychological phenomenon. That's as much as we should read into it. And indeed, you know, many countries, they're already back to where they were beforehand, before the pandemic and before the first lockdown hit. Countries in Western Europe and elsewhere. So I think that the jury's still out. I mean, I do think that, and this goes beyond the scope of, you know, my expertise in survey data. I mean, I do think that the pandemic has expanded the scope of the possible, right? That many things that were not possible, we've realized are possible. And that could change politics in fundamental ways in the years ahead, because suddenly proposals that seemed crazy, like, you know, have a universal basic income, very simple example. Well, we sort of did it overnight, basically, during the pandemic, and here we are, and society hasn't fallen apart. So I think that a lot of ideas that previously were outside of the sort of Overton window of what was feasible, considered feasible, and now you know, maybe considered feasible policies that we can implement.
And I do feel there is a parallel here with the financial crisis, that the last great convulsion, a very different kind of 12, 13 years ago, which its initial consequence for democratic politics was to freeze many institutions in place. There was a sort of need to get through the worst of it. It produced the Obama presidency in part, but it didn't seem to be massively politically disruptive, as established governments and established systems were trying to hold on and, as it were, get us through the worst of it. But over the medium term, it was enormously disruptive. It had profound consequences that we're still living through for democratic politics. And I'm sure that's likely to be true of the pandemic too. And someone used a phrase which I quite like, that we should think about political long COVID, in the sense that we all know that there are a range of experiences of the disease itself, one of which is an immediate crisis, but other people find long-term, surprising long-term consequences, including sometimes when they think that they're past the worst. And that's likely to be true of our democratic politics too. I think over the next 2, 3, 5 years, we're likely to be really surprised by the impact of the pandemic on people's understanding of the possible and also their expectation of what they expect in return for the sacrifices they made. Lucia, do you feel that the scope of the possible has really been broadened?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the case. And again, as I was saying earlier, I think it's not just the scope of the possible, but just it's also the sense that politics is important, right? That I feel that especially in Europe, and maybe especially in Southern Europe, there was a sense in which politics could be again managed according to knowledge, to expertise, to some sort of technocracy. Well, it became clear now that no political choice is ever just a technical choice, right? It's just a choice based on data. And so, yes, I think that the pandemic really brought that home, and it became clear that, as Roberto said, just the scope of politics is much larger. And I think that in relation to that, then also the frustration at politics when it fails or when it doesn't serve the interests of certain constituencies becomes much, much stronger, right? So you see a lot of, you see it in Italy, but also elsewhere, people who have been particularly impacted by the lockdown, for example, shop owners or restaurant owners being particularly angry at government, I think, just because if politics can be so expansive, it can do so much, why it's not helping us. So I think, again, as you said earlier, it cuts both ways. It opens up space for faith in politics, but then at the same time, it also makes frustration at politics bigger.
Roberto, we got a couple of questions here that I think are related, asking what we mean when we talk about people's dissatisfaction with democracy, and whether, in one question here, is part of our dissatisfaction an unwillingness to take an active part in our government, a desire to have them take care of us? How can we create a sense of obligation as well as rights? And there's another question too, which says, do you think that Western apathy for political change is a characteristic of our current attitude to democratic politics? So I'm sensing in these questions a kind of, if you're so dissatisfied with it, why don't you do something rather than just, I mean, I'm being slightly unfair and caricaturing these questions, but sort of, if you're frustrated, the point about democratic politics is it does allow active participation. It does allow involvement. First, do you think that's fair? And secondly, do you actually think that some of what we're calling populism is an expression of that? That actually there is, some of this frustration is coming out in people thinking, yes, we do want to have a different kind of say, a different kind of voice, a different kind of way of participating.
Yeah, I mean, there is an aspect of that is fair. And I think I would link it back to the earlier discussion about political parties and the way that the political party system is broken down as a way of representing people, or rather as a way of mobilizing people into politics. Because I think that, if you go back 50 or 60 years in this country and many other countries, political parties were not just these sort of empty shells for marketing a particular political brand, right? You had a democratic system in which people participated, not only in the sense that people turned up to vote once every now and then went home and got on with their ordinary lives, but also you had a really, really large proportion of the country who were members of political parties, and those political parties served almost as a kind of base of social activity, right? It was that they had important structures within communities, and so political parties served as a function between elections, whereby ordinary citizens' views could filter up through the political party, and indeed members of parliament would be individuals who had been party members for a long time but made their name in something else. Maybe had gone into business, or had been church ministers, or had worked in government in a civil service capacity, or in a school or hospital, wherever it may be. And so Parliament itself, or MPs, were more reflective of society as well, rather than being people who just gone into politics after doing it straight from their student union at university. So I think the party system has broken down as a way of representing people, and I think I think that explains to a great degree why people feel disconnected from politics, because they are. I think it explains to a great degree why there is a real interest now in direct democracy, because in a way the old systems of representation through political parties aren't functioning with the transmission mechanism from citizens to the polity that they used to have. So I think that there's a fair point there. However, I don't think it's entirely our own responsibility to just get on our bikes and do something political. I think that it requires institutional change to change the incentive structures for people to get involved.
Of course, one way you can guarantee dissatisfaction will go up is to try and channel that desire that people have to be involved in politics, and for them to see it go nowhere. As you say, if the institutions do not find a mechanism to connect what people want from their politics with the political decisions, frustration will rise. We've got another question here, which speaks to me. The question is, were the 1990s really golden for democracy, or was it a period of complacency and lost opportunity? I've written about this in the past. I think there is a cyclical quality to democratic politics, the history of democracy and crisis, which is that democracies in the good times are complacent. I mean, I think democratic politics on the whole, when things are going well, is not very good at thinking ahead and worrying about the next rainy day. And then under stressful conditions, well-established, institutionally grounded democracies are adaptable and flexible. And they do tend to come through crises strengthened, and then they become complacent again. Do you think one of the possible risks here is that if we come out of this pandemic with some democracies enhanced and in some sense among the populations that vote for these politicians that they've done a good job, that the result will not be hope, energy and dynamism, but just a bit more complacency? Do you think complacency, which this is a leading question, but do you think complacency is actually one of the perennial risks of democratic politics when it's going well?
Well, I mean, complacency is always a problem, because when you're complacent, you're at risk. It's precisely when you're paranoid about potential risks that those risks will disappear. A risk that has been identified is no longer a risk, by and large. So yes, I mean, I don't know whether the 1990s was such a golden period necessarily. Perhaps for the UK and the US, certainly not in Italy. But anyway, that's a broader conversation.
Lucia, do you think, when do people in Italy look back on as the golden era of democratic politics? Well, probably not the 1990s, I think.
No, I don't think, no. The decade of Berlusconi, I don't think it's looked back as a golden era. No,
is there a golden era?
No, well, it's probably the 50s, so the immediate aftermath of the war and the first decade of the New Republic. I think that is normally considered to be the golden era of Italian politics. And of course, again, that's exactly what one might expect to happen after the pandemic, right? A massive shock to the system, and then a new, a lot of innovation and a lot of dynamism immediately afterwards. I don't know whether that will actually materialize again, but certainly the 1950s.
So there's a question here that's come up a lot, and I've done a number of events thinking about this. It's something that I think has been in the back of many people's minds throughout the pandemic. And the question is, will the climate crisis enlarge the Overton window in the same way that you argue the pandemic has done? If not, does that mean that democracy will be unable to rise to the existential challenge? And a lot of people have been thinking about what's been revealed in the pandemic is not just that politics matters, but that we can do things we thought we couldn't do. And if we can do things we thought we couldn't do in the face of this challenge, why can't we do those things in the face of what is at least potentially a much graver and more serious challenge, which is the climate challenge? You know, when we had to, we did change the way we lived, change the way we worked, changed our expectations of our politicians. Do you see any relationship there? Do you think that there are grounds for optimism coming out of the pandemic, that this has shown us that for the bigger challenge, maybe the biggest challenge of all, the climate challenge, we do have within our democratic politics the scope to do things that we thought maybe weren't possible? Or do you think they're different?
Well, if I may start, I think the pandemic has shown that there is a possibility for democratic politics, in that as you said, there's much more that we can do than what we thought we could do. But at the same time, I think there are also important differences, right? So the pandemic is an event that struck everywhere in more or less the same way and in a very short period of time. So the intensity was it was just evenly spread and concentrated in time, I think, which is not the case with climate change. Climate change will not have its effects spread out evenly, and it will happen over time. And at the same time, I think that the reaction to the pandemic was one that was presented as temporary. So if shops had to close, it was only for a limited amount of time, which is something that you cannot say about the type of fundamental social economic changes that will have to take place to face climate change. This will not be temporary adjustments, and government will not be able to just step in and give you some sort of basic income for a couple of months. Yeah, so I think I'd be cautious with being overly optimistic about what the pandemic can teach us about climate change.
Yeah, Cambridge was a lovely city to live in during the lockdown because there were no cars on the roads. It's now gridlocked again, if I can be parochial. Roberto, we're nearly out of time, so this is going to have to be the last word. It's a big question. But when you think about satisfaction with democracy, you think about the challenges that democratic systems of government face, and what may be the biggest challenge of all, the climate challenge. Does the response to the pandemic give you grounds for hope?
Yes, I'm going to end on an optimistic note. I think the answer is yes. I think that we're already seeing the evidence of it in some ways. I mean, I think if you look at the really ambitious proposals that, the United States, the Biden administration has put out, I mean, it's quite a phenomenal turnaround. And US is not the only country that actually has gone back and upped its targets for dealing with climate change. So I think that it has given a sense that, it's expanded the boundaries of the possible and led us to think about what are the other existential risks that we're facing beyond disease epidemics, and how should we confront those? So I think I am cautiously optimistic.
So 50 minutes is not long to discuss such a huge topic, and thank you all for your excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to more of them, and as I'm looking now, there's a whole series of questions about the United States, and it is fascinating to think about just how different American politics looks and feels than it did 6 months ago. And that's not all about the pandemic by any means. And there's plenty more to discuss. And a lot of that discussion will be taking place in and around Cambridge, as well as in many, many other places too. But there are more Cambridge conversations to come in this format, this tight format, to answer huge questions. And the next one is on a very important topic. It will be hosted by the Vice Chancellor, and it will focus on the question of how to transform agricultural processes to feed the world. That will be happening on Thursday, the 26th of May. So we very much hope that people who joined for this will be able to join for that too. In the meantime, it just remains for me to thank Lucia and Roberto for a fascinating discussion, and to thank you all for watching and for your really excellent questions. And we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.